invite to the floor now the two teams that will be competing in this grand final. From Monash University, Monash 1. And from Monash University, Monash 2. I'd like to first start with some thanks, and it's a thanks to our major sponsor for this competition, Russell McVeigh, and to our secondary sponsor, Contact Energy. Thank you very much for your generous support. Without your support, this tournament would not have happened. It has been an honour and a privilege to host you in Wellington for Australs. We thought that everybody had a great time, and we hope that everybody enjoyed both the debating and the social aspect of this tournament. We had hoped when we were developing this tournament and putting it together that we'd have two teams in the final from Victoria, and we're glad that that was able to be arranged today. What I'll do now is introduce the panel of judges for tonight's debate. The chair of the panel and CA of the tournament from Vic University, Steve Wellington. From Ateneo de Manila University, Ali Zosa. From Melbourne University, Steph D'Souza. From Victoria, Udayan Mukherjee. Also from Vic, Seb Templeton. From Ateneo de Manila University, Gerard Valerio. From the Australia National University, Jacqueline Yates. From the University of Sydney Union, Daniel Farina. And from the University of Auckland, Corrine Martin. As is customary, there were three motions put forward for the final tonight. The two that aren't being debated are that the state should not privilege monogamous relationships and that we should implement a system of school vouchers. The motion that will be debated tonight is that we should introduce a Good Samaritan law. Without any further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker from the affirmative team, Sarah.
Ladies and gentlemen, a failure to act when you have the capacity to intervene to prevent a crime is morally culpable and deserves criminal censure. We think it's abhorrent that Kitty Genovese was left to die, even though 30 witnesses encountered her plight, failed to open the door, failed to call the police, failed to intervene to stop her attacker. That type of conduct is unconscionable, and that's the kind of conduct Monash 1 will not be willing to stand for. The aim of our model will be striking the appropriate balance. What we aim to do on the affirmative is incentivize appropriate behaviour from bystanders without enforcing unfair or unrealistic expectations. So how will our model work? We believe that individuals should be prima facie liable if present at the scene of a crime. To avoid criminal culpability, they will need to show a few things. They must firstly show that they had an honest and reasonable belief that they would suffered as much or more harm than the victim had they intervened. They would also need to show an honest and reasonable belief that they had no capacity to actually intervene in this instance. We think the notions of honest and reasonable are quite common in the law. It refers to a genuinely held belief that's based on reasonable grounds. And these are the kind of standards that are adjudicated by courts in a wide range of standards, including tort law. Moreover, if people do intervene, we believe this intervention must be proportionate to be justified. We're not willing to stand behind someone shooting someone to avoid a property offence. We think that particular level of action must be proportionate to the nature of the crime and the nature of the harm to the victim. How will this play out in practice? We think we'll incentivise a number of positive actions. At the easiest level, we will ensure that people call the police rather than ignoring a crime when it happens. But in a number of other instances, we think people will take more significant action, which we stand behind. Firstly, through physically intervening to restrain a crime when they have the capacity to do so. We don't expect an old woman to tackle a massive assailant when there isn't an honest and reasonable belief on their part they could actually act. But we do think when there is a proximity of capacity, people will act to prevent these crimes and often risk physical consequences. We also think it might be as basic as opening a door for a victim to provide them a refuge when they're being chased by an assailant. Those are the types of conduct which we think are important, which we want to incentivise. My first argument will be why it's principally justified to impose criminal responsibility for a failure to render assistance. This debate operates in a context of a state incapacity or inability to act. We're looking at instances where there aren't members of the police present, where there aren't sufficient disincentives for that criminal to act. And the only people that can intervene are those that are present at the scene. We are willing to impose unique duties on individuals where they have unique capacities to assist the state in performing its functions of policing and protecting individuals that merit protection. We think for that reason, we subpoena witnesses, we force them to testify when they have unique information, even if they shouldn't want to, because the overarching benefit to the state merits that kind of action. But why does this extend to potentially risking your own safety? We think when an innocent person is endangered by a crime, that triggers a moral obligation on those present at the scene to act. We don't think individuals have more value or more rights to protection merely because they're not the one who is actually attacked by a particular assailant. The mere fact that you have the good chance of not being the person that's being hit or not being the person that's being raped doesn't entitle you to divorce yourself from the consequence of that action, particularly when you have the capacity to intervene and the capacity to change that situation. We think, moreover, victims who are at the scene have a greater capacity to control their exposure to risk than the victim. You can watch the scene, you can calculate the risks of intervention, you can make a decision. To the extent you miscalculate or don't intervene appropriately, we're happy for you to be held liable. Finally, within this principle, we think an act-omission distinction lacks validity. We think when a failure to act causes harm, making a conscious choice to allow that harm to occur is unconscionable. We think ultimately the criminal law is concerned with intentional actions which lead to harmful consequences. A failure to act should be treated in the same way as actual action. We think ultimately we should pursue an outcome-based assessment. When there are terrible consequences, you have the capacity to act to intervene in those consequences, criminal culpability is justified and necessary. That's the principle we stand behind. Second argument, why this incentivizes the right types of interventions. We think people don't intervene for a number of different reasons. The first, and the most unconscionable, is bystander apathy. That may be triggered by not caring enough about the victim to actually act. That may be triggered by not caring enough about that particular crime to act. But often, it's triggered by a collective action problem. You believe that even if you don't act, someone else will act, someone else will intervene, someone else will call the police. We think that's an unacceptable failure which we need to remedy. In those instances, our plan reshapes these incentives. We think the likelihood of criminal censure means those people who are simply apathetic have a bloody clear incentive to change their action, to intervene, to actually do what they can to prevent that crime. That's a clear benefit. But we also accept that many people don't intervene because they fear for their personal security. We think that very fear means our policy strikes the appropriate balance. To the extent that people are incredibly scared of acting, criminal sanctions most likely mean that they won't intervene. We think those are the kind of people who would probably be exculpated under our model in the first place, provided they could show enough evidence that is honest and reasonable to do so. So we don't think this is going to force people who are incredibly fearful to intervene when they wouldn't otherwise. What it does mean is that people need to have a justified fear, and they have to have a justified belief that they cannot act. We think to the extent that fear is unjustified, we're happy to impose criminal liability. We're happy to hand out penalties to those who are genuinely fearful but on the wrong grounds, because we don't want to allow a culture of impunity when you can ignore the suffering of a victim when you have the capacity to act. We think knowing that you need to be genuinely fearful is important in reshaping behaviour, in increasing the bar before you leave a particular crime to be committed and ignore the consequences. Moreover, we don't think people are going to go too far. We think proportionality is a pretty common calculus in the law. In the law of self-defense, you're exculpated from crimes only if your response was proportionate to the magnitude of the crime. We think to the extent that people would go too far, we would prosecute that and would reduce that risk. We think people can calculate their ability to intervene and calculate the nature of that. Finally, on this point, we think to the extent that it's difficult to know exactly what kind of action would be appropriate, these are the kind of cases that would probably be quite high profile. There'd be high amounts of media attention. We think people could follow this and ultimately make a calculation. The final benefit here is that people intervene earlier. We think once you know there's a criminal expectation that you act, you're more likely to act, which prevents the harms to victims faster. We think a real problem under status quo is waiting too long and allowing the suffering of victims to go on. Finally, this is a deterrent for certain forms of criminality. We think changing the culture of apathy shifts the way that certain crimes are committed. And let's be very clear, we're talking about those crimes that are committed in the public space, in public view, when there's a risk of intervention from other people. We think it's important that criminals don't feel that they have a guaranteed space where they're not accountable, where there's no ability for anyone to restrain them. We think they have to calculate their decision to make the crime, not just based on whether they're stronger than the victim, but when they're stronger than the rest of the people in that area that could intervene to limit their capacity to commit that crime. We accept this isn't going to change every criminal's incentives, but we think for some, it'll increase the risks of entering that crime in the first place. We think that's a benefit. Ultimately, tolerating unaccountability for omissions is unconscionable, particularly when people have the capacity to intervene and the necessity to do so. We are very proud to propose.
Thanks very much, Karen. And now the first speaker from Monash to Emma.
The idea that any average normal citizen, that any one of you in this audience, could make a rational decision in the heat of the moment about what a proportionate and what a good reaction to the witnessing of a crime is outrageous. Especially given, at that moment in time, you're not only afraid for your own physical safety, but you're also afraid that you'll do something wrong, and you're also afraid of prosecution. We think those things cloud the judgment of those individuals in a really problematic way. And there is a reason why we train police officers for many, many years before we allow them to go out into the street and intervene in crimes and stop criminals. Because the harm of their intervention going wrong and the harm of them doing the wrong thing or over-applying force is incredibly, incredibly large. That's something we want to avoid in today's debate. So I'm going to interweave substantive and rebuttal in a very Monash way, and I'm going to ask 3 questions in this speech. First, what is your obligation as a citizen? Secondly, will their model actually change behaviour? And thirdly, even if it does, will that be harmful or actually good as they've claimed? So first, let's look to the obligation of a citizen. And here, we want to start by suggesting that we actually don't think there is a significant problem in society today, whereby people are just apathetic and people don't care. We think the largest majority of citizens do what they can under the status quo to intervene. We by and large think that's usually just calling the police, and we think that's a fairly reasonable standard. Why do we think people do that under the status quo? First, because people are empathetic and they do not like watching another human being be victimised. So we reject the characterisation that people just wander on by and allow people to continue to be raped or murdered in the first instance. But secondly, we think there's a direct incentive as a human to avoid crime being propagated in your society and to avoid you becoming a victim in the future. We think for that reason there's an incentive to call the police under the status quo. So we actually don't think that there's a significant problem. We think 99% of people do what is reasonable right now. But the impetus Kieran gave us, incidentally, in his speech, for why we should institute this model is just that the police can't be everywhere. The state can't do everything. We reject that it is individual citizens' obligation to make up for the failure of the state to put enough money into policing and to make sure there actually are police to see these crimes happen and to prosecute these crimes. With regards to the one example Kieran wanted to give us of Kitty Jenny Vesey and the fact that 30 people witnessed her die and no one called the police. For a start, people did come forward in the aftermath. In the initial period, people were genuinely afraid for their own safety. But secondarily, we think that's actually correlation and not causation in this debate. Because the reality is the opinions about domestic violence at that time was that it was a private issue. We don't think that's true under the status quo. So we actually don't believe there is a significant problem. But regardless of whether or not there is a problem, what is your obligation as a citizen? We think your number one and most paramount obligation is to do no harm, to not be a criminal, to not commit crimes against other people. We think people are by and large pretty good at doing that. We don't think you do have an obligation, we don't think you should have an obligation to put yourself in harm's way to protect another citizen who you don't know, who you've had no responsibility in that person being attacked. All Kieran told us was it's luck of the draw that you weren't the one attacked in that scenario. For a start, we don't think that's true in a lot of crimes where people are complicit in the action that got them into that crime in the first place. But secondly, even to the extent that somebody's accidentally mugged on the street and had nothing to do with that crime, we don't think there is an efficient gain in forcing other citizens to be responsible for those people. But if somebody chooses not to intervene, we think the government should respect that. We think individuals, as I said, by and large, do the right thing. So when they choose not to intervene, we think there's a pretty good reason. And that reason usually isn't, I'm too lazy to pick up the phone and call the police. That reason is usually, I'm genuinely afraid for my own physical safety in the short term. And also, I genuinely don't know what I would do if I were to intervene and how successful that intervention would be. And for that reason, we don't think citizens are actually the way that Kieran characterised them. But let's question, even if we accept that it's the obligation of the citizen, whether or not their model will actually change people's behaviour in any meaningful sense. First, with regards to the group of people who are just genuinely afraid, but are probably empathetic citizens who probably don't like the committing of crime in their society. We think the far-off threat of prosecution will not subsume their fear in the short term for their own physical safety, such that they would change their behaviour. If somebody is genuinely afraid of having retaliation committed against them, we don't think the fact that you might prosecute them down the line is actually going to get them to do what you want. But for people who Kieran wanted to characterise, people who just genuinely don't care, or people who are amoral, or people who are just lazy, I think the majority of those individuals are not actually going to be afraid of your prosecution because they're going to be aware that if they leave the scene quickly, if they get away quickly enough, no one's actually going to know that they were there to witness that crime, no one's actually going to know that they didn't call the police. We think for that reason, the threat of their prosecution actually isn't that significant. For the individuals whose behaviour does change, and we can see some people will now intervene when they wouldn't have otherwise, I think those individuals are likely to overreact. And especially that's true when you say to someone, you are a security guard, therefore you have more capacity to interact in that situation and more capacity to beat down on somebody. We think that message is incredibly harmful. So, we don't think it will change the majority of individuals' behaviour, but if it does, we think it's harmful. That brings me to my third point. First, with regards to the harms to the victim. We think that the people who are qualified to actually protect victims in this scenario are medical professionals in the event that a person has been injured, or the police. We think that if individuals start to intervene when they don't have that training, when they don't know what's best for that person, there is a likely outcome that that individual victim will be worse off under their system. When somebody intervenes and moves that person who's got a broken bone or a broken neck, when somebody intervenes and actually leads that person to bleeding out in a way they would not have otherwise, I think that's incredibly problematic. And the reality is, the majority of citizens walking down the street do not understand those risks. They do not have first aid training or medical training which would make them capable of doing what Kieran wanted them to. But let's talk beyond that. What about the harm to the person who actually intervenes? We think there are two really problematic ones. First of all, the psychological trauma of potentially intervening and watching it go wrong. And we think in the majority of circumstances, it will go wrong. In the majority of circumstances, those victims will be worse off than they otherwise would have, and that person who did intervene will have to live with that for the rest of their lives. We think that's incredibly problematic. But the second and much more immediate harm to that person is they might actually genuinely be right. They might actually be at risk of having their own physical safety threatened by this person. In that instance, when retaliation actually occurs and that person ends up harmed, that's a significant problem for their side that they haven't dealt with. But the third problem, and the third reason why there'll be a harm if people intervene, is the danger of those people completely miscalculating the situation. And we point you to the Gabriella Giffords example, where people actually weren't sure who the assailant was, and innocent people almost got shot by the very model they created and the very types of paradigms they wanted to enforce. Final argument and final question in this debate, what will the harm of their model be to the actual prosecution of these individuals? First, with regards to reluctant witnesses. We think most people will still run. We think most people who are genuinely afraid will still flee the scene. But what does their model do? It makes it infinitely less likely that those people are ever going to come forward and act as a witness in that case, because they're now afraid that if they do, they'll be acknowledging that they themselves committed a crime. I think that completely undercuts any benefit they could get in the short term, but we're actually incapable of prosecuting people in the long run. Secondly, we think they're more likely to flee the scene early to make sure nobody actually saw them there, which makes them a less good witness in the long run, even if you are capable of tracking them down, because they didn't actually see anything. We think that's incredibly problematic. And even if under their model they're capable of tracking these individuals down, we think those people now have a direct incentive to lie and say they didn't see anything and to say they weren't there, which sends the police completely down a like wild goose chase and actually means they're incapable of prosecuting these people. We think that's incredibly problematic. For the side that wanted to protect individual victims, we think they're incapable of doing it. For the side that actually wanted to prosecute crimes and make sure there were less criminals on the streets, we think they do the direct opposite of that thing. We don't think you have an obligation as a citizen to put yourself in harm's way to protect somebody else. But more importantly, we think it's an inefficient system. It doesn't protect those individuals in the long run, and it means we're more likely to have criminals in the street. We're very happy to oppose that very stupid measure.
Thanks very much, Gemma. And now the second speaker from Monash 1, Madeline Schultz.
The negative team wanted to pretend that this debate existed in a world where we had a choice about who intervened in these crimes. They wanted to pretend that there was a police officer or a trained medical assistant or an ambulance standing right there, and we were making some bizarre choice to ask members of the public to intervene instead when they were less trained. We weren't. This was about crimes where we didn't have a choice, where the reality was there were a limited number of individuals with a capacity to intervene, and the choice was about whether we prioritised their fear over the real harm that was happening to a real victim in the immediate sense. That was a vastly disingenuous characterisation from the negative team. This debate didn't exist in a world in which there was a police officer standing right there. I'm going to talk in my substantive material about changing the point of intervention in a positive way and what we do for crime cultures in society more broadly. Let's start with a couple of points for rebuttal. Firstly, is this policy necessary? We think the negative team's approach to this was rather weirdly in tension with the rest of their material. Gemma said everyone already intervenes. Firstly, we think this was somewhat weird, considering they thought that they would suffer great harms from intervening. But we would also say, if everyone already intervenes, if everyone already looks at those situations and says, I have a duty to intervene, we didn't bring any harm to this debate. We didn't do anything that made those people suffer, because they just kept doing what you said they were already doing. But if people are already intervening and people already view themselves as having that duty, we think it makes it all the more immoral and atrocious that some people aren't. We think it makes it all the more necessary for us to penalise those who act differently from the vast number of individuals who apparently look at those crimes and think, I have a duty to act. And so those 36 people who watched Kitty Genovese die and didn't open a door when her killer ran away, giving them the opportunity to do that, were particularly atrocious if you accepted Gemma's characterisation of them in this debate. Let's secondly talk about witnesses and the choices that they make and whether they put themselves at danger. Firstly, we would say the argumentation that says witnesses will do incredibly stupid, incredibly dangerous things and will massively overreact denies the premise that lets us allow self-defence in general. That even individuals in high adrenaline situations tend to make quite good choices about what level of intervention is appropriate. And the fact that we don't see rampant overaction in self-defence cases shows that people are broadly very good at making this calculus. We think individuals who are not at immediate risk and have the capacity to step back for a moment and think before acting are even more likely to make those good choices. We'd secondly say this policy actually isn't entirely new. It's been the case in Germany for about 5 years, and New York recently introduced it for drunk driving offences. And we haven't seen rampant overaction in those cases, right? Those particular societies have coped very well with that new situation. And there haven't been cases of people doing incredibly stupid things. But finally, we say that is attempting to debate in a vacuum. We don't have better actors available. And Gemma said it wasn't the role of the public to make up for police failures. It also wasn't the role of the victim to suffer for them. The fact that we didn't have other actors was important here. The victim wasn't responsible for that, and they didn't deserve to suffer simply because police had failed. We also thought it was disingenuous to suggest that it was a police failure to not have a police officer on every corner. We thought that was unrealistic. So the fact that sometimes crimes occur outside of the view of direct, trained interveners means that there is a role for society to do other things. Finally, let's talk about witnesses putting themselves at risk. We think that ignored Kieran's material about how witnesses balance choice. We saw no reason to prioritise them over others. Final point of rebuttal in terms of testimony. We have a capacity to offer these individuals immunity where we are reliant on their testimony to get a prosecution. We think often we aren't, and considering these are often physical crimes, we have sufficient evidence to get a conviction without them. But importantly, we would say their duty to act is more important than this. The necessity of preventing that crime is more important than the necessity of prosecuting it, because that preventing that crime has a far greater benefit. Finally, that was in bizarre tension with the argument that people are generally empathetic and don't care about the penalty. We think those individuals are quite likely to come forward, even if they do fear being prosecuted. Let's turn to my positive material and let's talk about changing the point of intervention. One of the most terrifying reasons the witnesses to Kitty Geneviese's murder gave for not intervening was that they thought it wasn't a crime. And to some extent, there was maybe reason for them to think that. A lot of them just thought it was domestic abuse and didn't care. That was probably more atrocious. But there's a lot of reasons why people hesitate to intervene. And some of them aren't because they're convinced that they shouldn't intervene, but because they're unsure if what they're intervening in is actually a crime, whether what they're witnessing is a robbery or some people playing around in a store. Their ability to measure that is problematic. We would prefer that they intervened preemptively. We would prefer that they stepped up as soon as they had doubt about that. Because if they prevented that crime from happening, that was more important than the potential handful of individuals who prevented something that wasn't a crime, where we could remedy the consequences of that intervention at that point. We think that's a particularly important thing to consider in this debate. But secondly, in terms of positive material, we think we change crime culture in particular areas of society. As UWA told us very vehemently in the quarters, there are areas of society where traditional policing will always fail. I think that is somewhat true, thank you UWA. But it's also not getting any better, right? That culture is not going to change without some kind of intervention. But the problem with that culture is not the inability of police to walk around in that society. They can arm up and walk in groups and protect themselves. It's a culture that says that crime in those communities is something that you as an individual don't get involved in. That says when you do intervene, you're a snitch, or you're an improper person, or you're not a proper member of that society, or you're someone who deserves retribution. Sending a social message that says the precise opposite, as our model does, is really important for changing the culture in those types of societies, in the types of communities where we do struggle to police those areas. Why is that? Because firstly, the foundation for building that intervention is building the trust where you believe that those around you would intervene for you as well. Forcing that to happen is the first step to getting people to exist in a society where they do it automatically. Getting people to believe that it's the right thing to do more broadly. Getting people to believe that it is their responsibility when they witness a crime or are involved in a crime to do something about it. Why does that matter? Because creating that narrative is the only way to create trust in those types of communities. Creating that narrative is the only way to change the fact that police can't be everywhere. And ambulances can't be everywhere. And at some point, we have to rely on members of society to do the right thing. And when they fail, we need to do something about it. It's not just Kitty Genovese that suffers from the lack of this policy. 2 years ago, a 14-year-old girl was gang raped on a highway in California. It is estimated 100 people witnessed that. 10 of them were later found to have footage of that assault on their mobile phones. Phones that could have been used to call the police. Phones that could have been used to do a whole range of things that would have saved that girl from what she suffered. It is atrocious that that happens in society. But what is more atrocious is that those 100 witnesses, there is no way of prosecuting them. There is no way of punishing them for what happened to that individual. That individual suffered, not because of what was done to her physically, but because of everything she will know for the rest of her life, that society stood by and didn't care enough to intervene. We think that is immoral. If the only thing we do is get people to call the police, we're happy to stand for that. But we think we get substantially more, and that's why we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Madeline. And now the second speaker. Wait. I now invite to the floor the second speaker for Monash 2, James Beers.
Let's be clear. We on the negative said most people would probably call a police officer when there was very little disincentive for them to do so under the status quo. What we said was deeply problematic was that if they weren't sure about whether they'd be prosecuted, and if they weren't a law student, or a police officer, or a security guard, that they would get involved, and they would make the situation worse. And we gave you quite a large number of ways in which that situation could get a lot worse. So we're not just talking about a situation in which there is a huge number of people who are suffering these really traumatic crimes that Madeline was concerned about. We said those were anomalies, but we said they could get worse, and they would get worse. And that is the reality that the affirmative team needs to engage with. First question in rebuttal. How do we get better prosecutions? Because let's acknowledge that what the affirmative team is after isn't just intervention. It goes a lot beyond intervention, and it extends more towards creating a safer society, and it goes towards protecting people into the future. So that necessarily has to be about more than just the crime in the short term. We were told that firstly, you have collective action problems insofar as you think that other people will take up the problem. That fear for your own safety compels you to hold back, and that people are not inclined to over-intervene under their model because they follow these cases. They know what the standard for honest and reasonable beliefs is. And the end result of that is you get better witnesses and you get better prosecutions. And that even if all the things we told you about people not being willing to come forward because of fear of prosecution, they could offer them immunity. That was the characterization of how prosecutions would occur. Firstly, for all the ways Kieran complicated his model to make it really hard to attack were exactly the same ways that people meant they wouldn't understand it. Because the key part of an honest and reasonable belief is an objective test under the law. It's not based on what you thought, it's based on a number of things. It's based on what a judge thinks or a jury thinks. It's based on an objective assessment of your capability to intervene in a situation. And he not only put that test at one level, he put that test at your belief, and then as to your capacity, and then as to your fear for your own safety. So in all those layers, he made it harder and harder for a lay person to ever understand. We said that most people have a fear for their own safety and they wouldn't change their ways. So primarily because of that model. But even if they did change their behavior, they would do it badly. So how would they do it badly? Because the first was with witnesses. We think it is very unlikely that people get their kicks out of following tort trials about whether you intervened in a crime or not. We think that is extremely unlikely, and it was ridiculous for Kieran to suggest that people would read a court transcript and understand and follow every nuanced little detail of what the judge said about what a security guard could do. So what would you do in that circumstance? If you are a security guard or you are a muscly person, you know that someone has probably been told that they have the capacity to make a greater change. They don't know the exact details about that case, but what they do know is that if they don't act and they aren't impelled to act, they will suffer some kind of criminal prosecution, they will suffer some kind of punishment. So what are they more likely to do? They are more likely to operate in a situation in which they are afraid and which they don't want to be prosecuted and get in there and do things badly. Because it is very complicated in getting, a fight is not a very simple thing. Preventing a crime is not a simple thing. If you hit someone in the head, you can kill them. Proportionality is not just a concept that people immediately understand, because people don't know what the body can do. They don't know what they can do. They don't have nuanced understanding that Kieran required them to do. But we also said it was really problematic for these witnesses in a later sense if you compelled them to intervene. Because if you mandated someone, anyone, not just someone that could, but someone that was maybe a little bit worried and got in there and even if they won, they still need to testify later, and they still need to be involved in the prosecutorial process at a later date. If you are so worried about the fear of prosecution, about whether your actions were proportional, whether they were honest, whether they were reasonable, the real key one here, then you are extremely unlikely, even after you've dealt with the psychological trauma of having to jump on someone, wrestle them off that girl on the highway, and pummel them into a pulp to get them to stop. That is a really problematic environment in which you are giving testimony. But finally, and as to immunity, we said that immunity is always going to be an after-the-fact question. People are going to have to weigh that up. They don't know that people are going to be offered immunity all the time. And indeed, if they are, that completely undercuts all Madeline's material about getting people to intervene. Let's move on to victims. We told you, and we have had literally no response, that people do not understand how to help other people If you have been stabbed, moving you is the worst possible thing you can do it. So everybody in the audience now, don't do it, guys. Because if you have a punctured lung and you move someone, it tears it open. If you have a broken spine, you have a greater risk of severing the spinal column and breaking nerves. Those things are people with have medical training should do. They are not things that someone on the street who is worried about being prosecuted should get in and do because they will probably do it badly. I'd like to hear a response from Chris. Let's talk about confusion. We think that you need to have a really good and clear understanding of in criminal trials because there's a range of things that can happen. We pointed to things like the Gabriella Giffords case, where the first witness, the first person that saw something was going wrong, drew his magnum, because this is the States and people packing. The second witness saw that guy take out his gun and shot him. Right? You need to have a clear narrative when it comes to crime. You need to have, firstly, a victim that understands who was attacking them. Crime scenes are complicated, they move fast. But you also need to have very clear evidence of whose blood is on the victim. Whose blood should be on the victim. Is the assailant really the actual assailant? But let's talk about crime culture. Because we were told that in high crime areas, you're seen as a snitch, and that's why you can't, get in and help these people out. Firstly, we think a high crime area should probably be receiving more police instead of untrained people intervening in crime. Secondly, having a law that says you should intervene in a crime is pro tip. Doesn't mean you're not seen as a snitch, right? You don't just go up to the leader of your local cartel and just like, no, man, it's cool. They would have prosecuted me if I hadn't. Oh, what the fuck? Probably more likely that you are a criminal and you don't care about the law. So like that was I'm being slightly facetious. So let's go on. Because Madeline's material was based around getting people, being involved and intervening in areas where they weren't sure crime was happening. Like people, playing in the store. Wow, that sounds a lot like someone intervening in something they weren't sure was a crime, and potentially over-intervening in something that wasn't a crime. I know. We also, moving on. So anyway, let's discuss the state failures. Because we think it's absolutely and prima facie unacceptable for the state to just be like, hey guys, we copped a bad one. We don't have enough police in your high crime area. We don't have enough people policing people playing in stores. That's on you. It's not acceptable for the state to just be like, you need to go and get involved. You need to be the one that is physically and psychologically grappling with criminals. We think it's prima facie unreasonable for the state to be involved in impelling trauma on its citizens because the state's role is to stay out of your life as much as possible, and if it can't, to avoid making you unhappy, to avoid making you risk your own life and potentially die. We think that there's a couple of things, there's a few problems here. It's true that there's not a policeman on every corner. That is obviously true. There's not one here in the room now. But we know that if something went wrong, we could call one. We know that the state tries to provide a really stable and a sustainable environment for us to go about living. But what are the problems of their model if it does work? Let's assume that there are a massive number of people going out intervening more. But even if they weren't intervening or doing it well or doing it badly, they were just calling out these crimes. What are the problems with that? When you have massively stretched resources, as the characterization of both teams has been in this debate, you have to make trade-offs when you have crimes. What does this mean? It means when you have a crime that has a lot of witnesses and a lot of people calling in, you have to prioritize that crime. You have to make choices about where you allocate your resources. That doesn't mean you do it well. If every person in this hall had to, call in when Madeline punched me for mischaracterizing her material, that would mean that, the ambulance call center or the police would prioritize that as a more serious issue than it would otherwise be, because I reckon I could probably take it. So the thing there is you have people making decisions about where resources have to go in a stressed context. We need to have a system that prioritizes those resources adequately and solves those crimes best. Because we were the team that had the most realistic conception of how crimes operated and how they should be stopped. We oppose.
Thanks very much, Beavis, and now the third speaker from Monash.
Mr. Speaker, either there is a very small number of people who are failing to do what they should, in which case they're deviants from an acceptable social norm who deserve that punishment, or there are large numbers of people who are doing it. And we think in that case there is a pressing need for a shift in the culture that allows that to occur. Most importantly, we think the balance between those two things is fluid and not set. It's defined by which crimes, which types of victim, the attitudes people have to those crimes. So it might be true that our attitudes to domestic violence are improving, but it is not to the extent that it's like changed the perspective of people on every crime, or the perspective to minorities who are victims of crime, or their perspective, as the negative side said, that some people deserve that victimhood and that they don't need to intervene on behalf of those victims. All of those perceptions that exist within society shift that balance. So for some crimes, we think that this is going to be about changing the culture of intervention. And for other crimes, it's going to be about punishing those who cruelly fail to do and show the empathy that they ought. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. Firstly, is allowing these crimes worthy of criminal punishment? And secondly, what does the world look like and what changes do we get under our policy in terms of crime reduction? So firstly, the characterization has been that the largest majority currently intervenes to some extent. So what are the reasons that that minority doesn't? There are only two classes of reasons in this debate. The first are the classes that are covered by our model. They can lead in evidence as to their lack of capacity. They can do that retrospectively with their lawyer. They can construct those things. But we think that in any case, it changes the perspectives of those people. It says that that is a question that they have to ask themselves. Is it an analysis that people should intervene? But it changes that default perspective. It changes the perspective from being, I don't have to intervene, I need to find a justification to intervene, to being, I ought to intervene. I ought to care about the safety of other citizens who look like me, suffer like me, and live in my community, and I need to find good reason not to. We think our model protects those people who find good reason not to. The only other class of people are those that are criminally immoral. Those who, because of their attitudes to the type of victim, their attitudes to the type of crime, choose to not show that empathy, or choose to show the type of apathy that allows those crimes to occur in the first place. We think it's important for the state to draw that line for complex moral questions as it does in other areas of criminality, because it's important to set those principles, because it can have normative changes in the way in which society views those changes. And our incapacity to apply it perfectly in every scenario belies the fact that changing that culture shifts the way criminals see the public sphere, shifts the way individuals choose their first response to the witnessing of crime, shifts the way they construct their default duty. And we thought those benefits were important in this debate. But should the state be allowed to co-opt citizens? Obviously, the state should maximise the capacity of professionals to intervene wherever possible. But where citizens benefit from the change in the culture that we talked about, to rubbish Madeline's material is to misunderstand the way in which you truly shift the culture from being one that tolerates crime to one that sees every single crime, regardless of whether or not they're the direct witness, but a culture that is being propagated by the existence of crime, the toleration of crime, that leads people to feel as though that is the culture of crime that they should engage in, or that they ought to engage in because it's going to apply to them anyway. Changing that sense of trust, changing the attitude of responsibility is essential to getting them to shift that perspective and getting those communities that have a high level of crime to have every member of that community, rather than just the individual statistics within that crime profile, to shift the way in which that community deals with the police and deals with criminals. We think that increases the uncertainty for those criminals. We think it changes the way they view that space because they know that they're not up against one weak person. They're not up against that minority. They're not allowed to get away with that crime because all of society is what they have to weigh against. That was the shift in perspective that we thought our model delivered. But we think the state ought to co-opt people where they have unique capacities. We think it is incredibly inefficient and dangerous to have a police officer on every corner of every street, Mr. Speaker. So it's essential that where the state cannot find another way of protecting individuals, or to protect them in such a way would be so inefficient or so harmful, they should co-opt citizens, in the same way as they subpoena witnesses and they demand jury duty out of people. We think that we conceptualize a sliding scale of those obligations. So where your capacity to prevent a huge, permanent harm to a victim, we should expect that person to intervene, because that's the same type of expectation they would have on other people if they were the victim of that. We think the state should not prioritise the strongest people who have the greatest capacity to prevent crime over the weakest, most vulnerable people who are systematically disempowered because they are the victim, because they're the member of a minority, or because they're the victim of a particular crime that society fails to value appropriately. I think those are the people whose the state's priority is greatest, not to protect people from having to defend their actions in court where they had the capacity and failed to do it. We think that that adjudication, that process of assessment should occur, and people should be scared of that assessment, and that is the assessment they should be making when they exist in a society. Secondly, what changes do we see in the world under our policy? Firstly, on preventative action. We change that attitude to the public space. There is a normative force on average citizens that comes from the way crimes are constructed. We're not talking about your average criminals here, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about average members of the public who see the things that are criminalised and craft their norms about what they should do in society and what they should not do in society based on what the law says they ought to. The system is incredibly good at providing those people with flexibility. It provides them flexibility in self-defense. It provides them flexibility in the way in which they construct other types of defenses in terms of necessity and other ways in which they go about adjudicating the degree of malice involved in a crime in the sentencing process. The system is good at taking difficult decisions and adjudicating that line and providing the flexibility that allows us to vary our punishments, vary that standard accordingly. What about overreactions, Mr. Speaker? We think firstly that they're rare, because of the same capacital limitations that the negative side wanted to talk about that are going to limit that intervention. In terms of security guards, we think that they should and do receive extra training, and they have professional standards already that differentiate their duties, and that seems to be working well. Secondly, we think that the harms can be managed. We think that you can get better public service announcements. In fact, we think James Beavis would be a perfect candidate to the public service announcement recruiting officer for telling people that that's going to occur. And for a negative side who conceded that 90% of people already do intervene, right? They're already going to try and be moving that body. I think that's something we should probably invest in as a society. Who's for me? While we're at it, let's get some gun control happening so that people aren't packing automatic weapons capable of shooting multiple people around them. I think those harms can be mitigated. The suggestion that they don't understand our test was the best material of the negative side. The beauty of the test of honest and reasonable is they don't have to. The defense looks at the reasonable person in that position. It assesses the grounds that they can lead. It assesses the information they have. It assesses their capacity. They don't need to know about it. They don't need to understand it. They don't need to know every case. We think they just need to know that they're the questions they need to be asking themselves, and that's a duty that they have. On witnesses, 3 responses. Most witnesses are empathetic people, as the affirmative side and the negative side have agreed. So what we need is leverage against those who aren't, and that's what our side provided. We said that mostly we can get these victims because your capacity to flee is limited, right? In a world in which there are CCTV cameras, the world in which there are other witnesses who did intervene who can identify you, the extent to which it happened in your street, so you're already in your house and we know where you live. All of these things can occur, but just because the policy can't occur every time does not mean that where those people fail, where that empathy fails and we know their identity, those people do not deserve the criminal liability that we can give to them. But we think that prospective duties should be prioritised over a retrospective vision of law enforcement, because the harms are irreversible and are not well done so by the criminal justice system in trying to undo the harm to those victims. We think that there are already challenges to getting effective deterrent and stopping using the criminal justice system, those crimes occurring without sentences. So we should try and do it prospectively wherever possible to try and prevent that harm from occurring in the first place. Beavis's material was that people will call all the time. We would rather invest in bigger call centres and more operators and change the way people viewed that public sphere, because that was how you truly reduce crime, by changing the calculus of criminals, because instead of it being 101, it was them on all of us, and that was the world we wanted to live in.
Thanks very much, Chris. And now the final contender speaker for this debate is Lee.
Mr. Speaker, Chris told us with some classic Chris verbose rhetoric that we're going to change the culture in communities to the default being intervention. Gemma, right at the beginning of our case, rejected the premise that people don't care about crime in the community. She told us that people have a natural incentive to dislike crime, so in general, we'll call the police. So the real way that you change the paradigm is as follows. Firstly, if people don't intervene, they have an incentive to hide the fact that they didn't intervene, and that ruins prosecutions in the long term with having meaningful and truthful witnesses. And secondly, that people intervene inappropriately when you create that default that they should intervene. And it might even mean a minor intervention, like moving someone in a scenario where they were the victim of a crime because you feel like you have to do something in that scenario to pass that legal test, mean that they bleed out or that they are injured in the more long term. That was the problem with changing the culture if they did so at all. I'm going to look at three things in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to analyse whether there is a problem and whether they're actually solving it. Secondly, I'm going to analyse why why mandating the Good Samaritan law is terrible for witnesses, and finally, why it's terrible for victims. So firstly, is there a problem? Kieran told you that the problem under the status quo is apathy. He told you, but Gemma told you in response that generally people will call the police. But she also told you that if they don't, they have serious reasons or fairly good reasons for not doing that, being personal reprisals. They thought they got around this by saying that they had a legal test being honest and reasonable. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that in a situation of trauma or witnessing trauma, you can't be reasonable. You do not know what the right thing to do is. People will overreact, they will erratically react because they don't want to don't want to be prosecuted, they don't want to do the wrong thing, but they also don't want to face physical reprisals for themselves. That means their decisions are more likely to be erratic and therefore more likely to be the worst kinds of decisions that we wanted to talk about under our side of the house. That is the reason we train police officers for 2 or 3 years through basic training. But the second imperative that Madeline wanted to set out was police resources. She said that there are just not enough police on the streets, and that is a problem that we cannot address. Mr. Speaker, it seems obvious, but the failing of the state to allocate resources is not the responsibility of citizens to plug that hole, particularly when it can put themselves in danger. So we don't think in the majority of situations there is a problem, because people tend to call the police, but if there was a problem, it's their right to not call the police, and importantly, it will likely aggravate the situation. Chris told us, with respect to their model, that people can weigh up this legal test because a judge adjudicates reasonableness in a court. The fact that a judge was adjudicating it, or a jury in some scenarios, was the exact problem. In the moment of that trauma, in the moment of that crime, people cannot make the appropriate legal decisions, people are erratic, and people don't know what to do. Chris told us, moreover, finally, actually I'll deal with this in the second issue. So that's why, in principle, there isn't a problem. But secondly, let's deal with why this is really bad for witnesses. Because Chris told us that security guards are trained, so they're not going to overreact, they're not going to get into a serious scenario and therefore be prosecuted. What that didn't answer was what Beavis told you, which was this. The burly guy, who is not a trained security guard, doesn't know exactly what to do in that scenario. But you've created a default position, which is that he should intervene because he's burly, because he can intervene, and that would be perfectly reasonable for him to intervene. That was the problem of their side. Secondly, on witnesses. Chris told you that at worst, even if their model didn't work to change behaviour, at worst, we would prosecute those people and it would be punitive to those people who just didn't care about crimes and would intervene. That belied what Gemma told you at the beginning of this debate, after she followed it with some even-if responses. She said there is a practical problem of finding people who do not report these things, and that there is an incentive to hide what you've done. What Chris told you in response to this response was that the fact that we have CCTV means people will come forward. Firstly, the reality is that that's an anomaly. We don't have CCTV everywhere, and also people don't know if there's CCTV there as well. And also, if it is true that people are really scared for their physical safety, they will still hide that behaviour. So moreover, on witnesses, Madeline told you it was intention for our case to say that the population was generally empathetic, but also that people would not come forward later. It wasn't actually attention, it was just analysing different stakeholders. So I'll do it again. Firstly, we told you, and I repeat myself, that many people under the status quo will call the police. So what actually changes under a mandated Good Samaritan law under their side of the house? Firstly, sure, some people will act perfectly and perfectly calibrate the appropriate, proportionate, honest and reasonable and fair response, but we think that is a minority. Secondly, we think people will fear that they have not acted enough and will feel like that their reaction will be an underreaction, and as a consequence of that will not react at all, will run and will not come forward in the long time. The serious and pernicious harm of that is that good witnesses in the long term are not there in the courtroom when you need to prosecute and actually get a criminal conviction. The third scenario, or the third stakeholder, is those who actually do intervene and respond to the change and the incentives on their side of the house. Two outcomes. One, they get it 100% right, but more likely, they get it wrong and they suffer the serious psychological trauma of moving a victim inappropriately and seeing that victim bleed out, and it being their fault that that victim bled out because you said they had to get up and they had to intervene in that scenario. That psychological trauma when something goes wrong, or incidentally, even if they do the exact right thing, the most proportionately right thing, Mr. Speaker, that person might still die traumatized victims. But merely witnessing a scenario and forcing people to stay there and intervene can be a psychological trauma in and of itself. Thirdly, or fourthly, on witnesses, crime cultures and response to material. Mr. Speaker, we think the worst possible thing for cultural communities that have a culture of crime is giving a license to people in those communities to be violent. We think those communities, the types of ones where people are particularly violent, and invigorating that violence and giving a license to violence is probably the worst possible default message, to use Chris's rhetoric, that we could possibly send. Third question in this debate: why Good Samaritan laws will necessarily endanger victims. There are two dangers in this side of the house that we brought you that they just wanted to skirt around in this debate. The first is an immediate physical danger to the victim, because they could at no point in this debate even attempted to explain to you why, even an education campaign could demonstrate to witnesses what to do to a victim in various scenarios or various criminal activities. What certain injuries require a certain response, or what certain weapons require a certain response, and how to deal with it, how to manage that physical danger, or for example, how to get the criminal away in the scenario. That creates a physical danger to the victim and incidentally to the witness. But the second one is the escalation of the crime, and this is what Beavis told you with the Gabrielle Clifford's example. Well, the problem is when someone intervenes particularly early, like they wanted to talk about on their side of the house, particularly in cultures where you allow guns, that means it becomes very confusing in a scenario to work out who is the assailant, who is a victim, and who is a witness, because people are pulling out their guns, or people are pushing other people up against the wall. The consequence of that is the situation gets more and more confused, and if people truly respond to your incentives on that side of the house, more and more people are going to confuse the situation and escalate the crime. So that's bad for all the victims or the potential victims in that scenario. Mr. Speaker, at the end of this debate, we think it is far too difficult for the average person to perfectly calibrate the response in a legal sense, and because of that, will lead to perverse outcomes. The motion falls.
That concludes the substantive portion of this debate. We now turn to the reply portion. To sum up the case for the negative, I invite back to the floor Jim.
In summary of this debate, I'm going to ask two questions. First, is any intervention, no matter the type and quality of that intervention, better than no intervention at all? And secondly, would the model of the affirmative prevent crime in the long run? So to the first question, Madeline told us that police couldn't be on every street corner, but people could. And for that reason, people should be forced to intervene in this way. We told you, broadly speaking, that no intervention, or more importantly, the subsequent intervention of a police officer or an ambulance worker, once that person had called the police, as they likely would, was going to be preferable. Because this debate wasn't just about the one stakeholder being the victim of that crime, it was a balance of stakeholders. So I'm going to address three. First, for the victim of that crime. We told you continuously, the victim of that crime is in very real and very immediate physical danger if somebody intervenes and does the wrong thing. We told you it is difficult to expect an individual to perfectly calibrate the medical response to that person's injuries. We heard literally no response from the affirmative. But it went further than that. We told you that those individuals were likely to be in further danger because of the miscalculation of that person in intervening, because that person might be confused about the severity of that crime, because that person might be confused about who the victim was and who the assailant was, meaning that person might end up in a worse situation than they otherwise would have been. We told you that on the balance of probabilities, that intervention wouldn't be good. But the reality was, this debate wasn't about no intervention for that person or some intervention. We told you we proposed a delayed intervention that was done by trained individuals who actually knew what was going on. That was better for that person. But what about for the witness? We told you there was a threat to them in a very physical and direct sense, that they actually could be the victim of retaliation of that criminal, or they could end up getting killed themselves when they chose to intervene and lost despite being a belly security guard. That was something the affirmative could never actually justify in this debate. But even more broadly, in a long-term sense, we told you that the psychological harm of intervening and getting it wrong and watching that person die or accidentally shooting somebody who actually genuinely wasn't a criminal would be significant and long-term. Once again, we heard no response. But there was a third stakeholder, and that was the perpetrator of the crime. and the people surrounding that crime. We told you that there was likely to be an overreaction on the part of that individual in order to make sure they couldn't possibly be prosecuted in the future. And that meant that the perpetrator of a minor crime might actually end up being far more hurt than they deserve to be. We thought that wasn't a good thing either. So in actual fact, this intervention wouldn't have been good. And remember, that was all of that assuming their case at the best, assuming their case actually got people to intervene in any meaningful way, which we never conceded. And in reality, there was no real meaningful response to my analysis about why people would always prioritise the short-term physical safety of themselves over the long-term threat of prosecution, even if the affirmative needs debate were able to demonstrate that that prosecution would be real and likely to occur. So we didn't think they would intervene, but we told you, even if they did, it was worse not only than no alternative, but than our alternative of trained people doing it in the long term. They didn't help that person, but would they prevent crime in the long run, irrespective of each individual case? First, on prosecution. We told you that most crimes, given not all crimes, but most crimes, required witnesses. And the affirmative team lost in this debate because they forced people to run quickly to make sure they weren't seen and to make sure they couldn't be prosecuted. Because they forced people to lie and say they weren't at the scene, even if they were, in order to protect themselves. And all they relied upon in the affirmative team was Chris's analysis that there are CCTV cameras or somebody might dob them in. We thought that was an anomaly at best and wouldn't actually meaningfully get these people to come forward. The only other response we got was that you could offer those people immunity to make sure they would come forward. But Madeline and Chris never justified why someone was likely to come forward and hope that they were granted immunity, which wouldn't be guaranteed and would always be after the fact. In reality, they lost you witnesses. And those witnesses were also going to be less good at doing their job when they were a part of the crime and that crime scene was less clear to interpret to those individuals and to the police. But finally, what they did was undercut the incentives of government to actually beef up real and meaningful security in those areas of crime culture that Madeline wanted to talk about. They didn't protect that individual victim, they didn't undercut crime in the long term, they failed to meet their burden in this debate.
And for the final speech in this debate, I invite back to the floor the leader of the affirmative team, Jeremy.
The first question in this debate was, is it principally justified to impose criminal responsibility for failing to act? At the start of this debate, I outlined a clear context for action. There were certain instances where the state lacked the capacity to intervene to prevent or resolve crimes. And for that reason, the negative side was operating in a vacuum. Our policy wouldn't be necessary if crime was predictable and if there could really be police officers on every street corner. But there couldn't be, and that's why we needed action. We were happy to impose active duties on individuals where harmful consequences to victims occurred and individuals had the capacity to act. As I showed you, the act-omission distinction, or the do-no-harm expectation, lacked foundation. Criminality was always based on unacceptable conscious choices, and we said that individuals shouldn't be insulated from the consequences of these choices, even if it is manifested through inaction. We were never willing to prioritize the safety of one person at the automatic expense of a victim who also didn't consent to that harm being visited on. We thought this was particularly problematic where it advanced cultures of criminality, as Maddie showed you. We thought we needed to readjust the expectation in society towards action in instances where the state couldn't act. But the second question was, will criminal responsibility lead to better outcomes for the prevention and resolution of crimes? This debate operated under two possible characterizations. The first was that the vast majority of people adhere to the preferable norms and intervene appropriately under status quo. If this was true, we were happy to prosecute deviance from this existing norm. At minimum, our plan entrenched the expectation of what was appropriate for these people. But we also think it had the benefit of raising the bar of acceptable intervention. We thought that merely making a phone call wasn't enough when you had the capacity to physically intervene. We thought acting too late was unconscionable when the harms to the victim were immediate. These are the direct implications I brought you in my first speech. But applying the alternative characterization, if a large number of people failed to meet these acceptable norms, we were to change this default setting. We thought it was necessary to remedy a collective action problem, which means people may not act, not because they're bad people, but because they think someone else will pick up the slack. We said there was a failure of the status quo and an expectation we needed to change. The negative team pinned their case on the idea that people would act in a harmful way that makes the situation worse. What this firstly lacked was a comparison to the other options. Even if we accepted in some instances that victims made mistakes, why was the situation better than allowing no action? Why was the situation better than allowing no capacity to intervene when there's no police officers to actually do so? But moreover, we rejected the notion that this action was inevitably harmful. And we were very clear. We never set our standard as victims perfectly calibrating their choices before they make a decision. We wanted people to meet the same standard of a reasonable person that we expect across tort law and across criminal law. And what that did, as Chris showed you, is assesses these people in that particular position to assess whether they had reasonable grounds for inaction and a reasonable incapacity to act. We were happy to stand behind that as a legitimate touchstone. In terms of victim testimony, we firstly showed you that in most instances we could find out who these witnesses were and ensure they testified. But if we brought the altruistic conception of the opposition, people would testify, and these would be the best witnesses. Moreover, we were most concerned with acting at the time, rather than subsequent testimony after the harm was done. We were capable of preserving incentives through awarding immunities. So ultimately, this debate was about an imperfect context where state inaction was impossible. We weren't willing to ignore that vacuum. We thought moral responsibility was justified. That's why Monash won this tournament.
The judges will now retire to consider their verdict. I would invite you all to give one final clap to both houses. As a member of our Supreme Court, he's going to give us a few words on his experience with debating in the past. I invite up to the floor now Justice Griffith.
The first thing I think I should say is I'm very impressed. I don't envy the judges their task. It's a good thing there are quite a number of them. The hallmarks, I think, of good speaking, and I'm not going to critique the speakers, because that's not my function. I just want to say two things before I move on to what I've been asked to talk about. The hallmark of good speaking is clarity and simplicity. Normally, in an occasion such as this, and in a legal context, one is endeavouring to persuade. One has to have one's ideas clear in one's head, so as to adjust to the scene as it develops in the course of a discussion. And I thought every speaker had that very well taped. In actual fact, I rather thought I had a pre-vision of an almost full bench at the High Court of Australia in 30 years' time. I've been asked to talk very quickly about the importance of open debate and free exchange of ideas. There may be some countries where such a discussion as we've had tonight couldn't easily take place. Before I traverse briefly my subject matter, I'm going to acknowledge immediately that it's not easy to say anything very new about what one might call generally freedom of speech or freedom of expression. The task I've set myself reminds me of the story of the English professor who went to Japan to address a group of students and academics in Tokyo on his specialist subject. He, of course, required an interpreter, and the interpreter indicated to the English speaker that he would signal, the interpreter would signal when the speaker was to stop, so that the interpreter could then interpret what had just been said. 15 minutes went by. The interpreter then gave a very short translation. This somewhat puzzled the speaker, but anyway, he carried on. Another 15 minutes went by, followed by a very short translation, and then another 15 minutes, the same, and then after the hour's speech, there was a very, very short translation of the last 15 minutes. The speaker was extraordinarily puzzled by this and thought this must be an exceptionally gifted interpreter to be able to encapsulate all his words and wisdom so briefly. He was later told by a person who he knew in the audience who spoke Japanese that the translator had, after the first 15 minutes, said, "He hasn't said anything new." At the half-hour mark, the translator said, "He still hasn't said anything new." At the 45-minute mark, the translator said, "I don't think he's going to say anything new." And at the hour mark, the translator said, "I was right." I hope I won't fall as fully into that trap. We all know, don't we, that freedom of speech and expression is a cornerstone. I don't say the cornerstone, but a cornerstone of a democratic society. I don't imagine anyone here present needs much persuasion about that. The first thing most dictators try to do is to control the means of public dissemination of ideas and criticism within their countries. No one likes being criticised, but once you suppress criticism, particularly of those who wield power, you're on a very slippery slope. The difficulty, which challenges all democratic societies, is where to draw the line between total freedom of speech and full control. We obviously can't tolerate total freedom of speech, but equally we can't tolerate full control. We have to have some control, but how do we go about deciding where to pitch it? First of all, I would like to suggest that the benefit of any doubt must go to freedom. In some cases, I think most of us would agree, the law can properly control what people are able to say. Examples are defamatory utterances, indecent utterances, and racially injurious utterances and publications. The only principal basis on which a state can properly control what people do and say is when not having that control would represent a major threat to the public good. The other side of this coin is that citizens must be prepared to tolerate some offence, some discomfort, and indeed some hurt in what they hear from others, to allow other citizens to enjoy freedom of speech and action. It's a pretty poor freedom which doesn't allow you to hurt anybody. The tricky bit, as I have said, is where to draw the line, and this is where, as you will all know, where the courts come in. Parliaments in democratic countries which respect human rights usually legislate in general terms in this area, forbidding, for example, offensive or disorderly behaviour. Some behaviour which expresses ideas and points of view and speech of the same kind is offensive to other members of society. They don't like it, they're offended by it. But how offensive does it have to be before the speaker or actor loses the protection of the right to freedom of expression? Now, the answer that we have established in New Zealand, and this is a very short and probably somewhat inadequate paraphrase, is that citizens should be, I'll put it the other way, the state is entitled to intervene when what is said or done goes beyond what a citizen should be expected to tolerate in the circumstances in which it takes place. And that has to be an assessment or judgment that the courts make if a prosecution or civil proceeding is brought. When you engage in open debate, as at a contest such as this, or as a matter of protest action for something you don't like, or by way of public speech, you're normally endeavouring to make a point about what the government or somebody else is doing that you don't like. You are protected in a democratic society under the rule of law by your right to freedom of expression in doing so. A robust and independent judiciary will ensure that you cannot suffer unless you clearly go beyond the bounds of what other citizens, what our citizens are expected or can be expected to tolerate. Now, I want to say something very quickly about the value, as it seems to me, of a tournament or a competition like this, where people come from different countries and exchange ideas under the framework of a debate of this sort of kind. It seems to me that it's exceptionally important that open societies are receptive to different cultural values and practices and ideas. In the increasingly globalised world in which we live, societies are constantly having to adjust through immigration and for other reasons, to adjust to new ways of doing things and thinking about things. Different religious practices within a community are just one example. I want to suggest to you that the key concepts here are understanding and tolerance. It is vital that we strive to become familiar with an approach to whatever it is that is different from the one with which we are familiar. And it's vital to understand why there is that difference. We should be prepared to accept that there are many routes to the same goal, and one's own route, although a preferred route, is not necessarily suitable for all kinds and conditions of people. The cultural exchanges that take place during an occasion such as this can only help to foster understanding and acceptance of different ways of doing and seeing things. This, you may think, is just flowery philosophical stuff. But I suggest to you that my two underpinning themes of understanding and tolerance are excellent foundations for living life generally. In whatever field you find yourselves as you move into an ever more interrelated world, I think you would do well to have these two desiderata, understanding and tolerance, at the forefront of your armoury of values. A lot of you in this room, I suspect, will be called on to give leadership in your several societies as you gain more experience and maturity in your different fields. Leaders are called on to lead, not necessarily to reflect the easiest or the least controversial route. I hope these very brief remarks of mine will have struck some chord and that you will have found them helpful as you move into your careers.
Justice tipping is a great word. Free University in New Zealand, but you could well be forgiven for thinking he comes from Victoria University when he says that the presumption must always be towards freedom. Thank you again. The second speech this evening is from our major sponsor for this tournament, Russell McVeigh. I invite before Andrew Hunt.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, have you had a good time? Yes. Have you had a good time? Yes. That's why we sponsor an event like this. Forget about what you heard from Tim Clark last night. It's all about having a good time. And I'm pleased to say from what I've heard, it's pretty obvious that this year's Australs are no different from previous year's Australs, from what I've heard. There's many of you who have left a little bit of yourselves behind in Wellington. And there may even be some of you who are taking a little bit of Wellington with you. And that's all part of creating an international network of young, vigorous intellectuals. From the audience reaction, one of the reasons why we sponsor an event like this obviously is to create an atmosphere of expertise, give people an opportunity to really excel. I must say I was very pleased to hear the reaction when the adjudicators were introduced all to us. Quite clear from the reaction of a number of them that scoring is something obviously they're pretty expert at. It's just great to induce audience participation in that way, and I want to thank the people who presented and introduced them in that way to us. Being serious for one moment, and literally only one moment, because that's all I'm capable of. What a great debate we had tonight. I want to thank the people who came up with those motions. I think the motion that we had debated tonight was a motion very worthy of a final like this. I want, if I can say, congratulations to the teams. That was a fine debate. It was a really excellent debate. Both teams really worked their hearts out to give us a very entertaining debate. We wish you the very, very best. Obviously, we've got no idea who the winners are going to be. I have to say, from a Kiwi perspective, although, as was said by Daniel at the outset, that it's great that the trophy is going to stay in Victoria, or with Victoria, it will be rather a sad thing for us after 2 successful years for Victoria University of Wellington. It will be a sad thing for us to see that trophy very temporarily for 1 year only. Across the Tasman for a bit of a polish. We look forward to seeing that coming back to this place, not next year, but the year after that. And I'm very, as an alumnus of Victoria University, I'm very confident in my thoughts around that. On behalf of Russell McVeigh, if I can, please just take a moment to thank the organising committee for this great event. As I think comes through relatively clearly in the brochure, the Victorian team did not have a huge amount of time to get things organised to put this event together. We were absolutely thrilled when we were approached to be the major sponsor for this particular event. Debating is something which in this country our firm really believes in, and we sponsor a lot of debating and are very proud to do so. So we want to thank you for approaching us and giving us an opportunity to sponsor this fantastic event. We really value it, and it's just great to see a full Paramount Theatre here tonight, coming here to watch the best of what Australasia's got to offer. We really thank you for the opportunity. We also want to thank the conveners, the 2 co-conveners in particular. If we can thank the entire team via the 2 conveners, Joanna, Daniel, thank you so much for your efforts. Really appreciate it. Finally, obviously, we must thank, microphones, finally we must thank the adjudicators, the other people who must get a special mention for tonight. There's been a big adjudication team, obviously, that's been involved in looking after, judging a huge number of debates. The great thing about adjudicators is there will always be controversies in the nature of debating. That's what makes debating so much fun. So I want to especially thank the adjudicators for their particular efforts. Obviously, most of them are outside, but if somebody can please on my behalf pass on our thanks from our firm for the contribution that they've made, because without adjudicators, there wouldn't be a debate really. There certainly wouldn't be a debating competition. So I want to especially thank Finally, we do hope those people who are not from Wellington have enjoyed their time here in Wellington. We Wellingtonians, I know I don't have a very convincing Wellington accent, but I have to tell you that when I became a New Zealand citizen and I had to give the speech on behalf of the new New Zealand citizens, I got up and made a speech, and the first thing I said was, were it possible for me to say pledge allegiance simply to Wellington, that is the pledge of allegiance that I would have made. So I'm a great fan of this city. I hope that those of you who have come from afar have enjoyed your time here. I know the weather hasn't been great, but for those Australians, the thing that comes out of the sky that's called rain. Obviously, if you're from Brisbane, you know something a little. We love yes, that's the Brisbaneites for you, all right. Snakes. Don't be raising issues from this week and the success you've had. No boasting here. All right, thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you again very much to the organisers for a great competition. Hope you've enjoyed it. And look forward to seeing you in 2 years' time. Cheers.
Our next speaker tonight is Christopher Bishop from Victoria University. You all know him very well by now. He is going to speak about an award that we give out called the Johnson Fanslow Award, and I invite him to the floor.
Thanks, Daniel. I've been asked to speak about the Jock Fanslow Award, which is the cup for the best speaker in the grand final of this competition. Jock Fanslow was a legend of New Zealand debating, who was tragically lost to New Zealand in debating far too soon. He won Australs for Victoria in 1980, the first time a New Zealand team had won the Australasian Championships, and also went on to win it again on home soil in 1982, joining an elite group of people who had won the Australasian Championships twice. He also won numerous debating competitions in New Zealand, including the Parliamentary Shield twice, which is a prestigious adult debating competition in Wellington, and a variety of New Zealand University and Wellington tournaments. He was described by one of his debating partners as a Scud missile, a third speaker. He was known as a witty and charming debater, pleasant and engaging, but really ruthless in the best way third speakers are. The late Lord Cook of Thornton, who adjudicated one of his moots when he was a law student at Victoria University, said that, and then we had Mr. Fanslow, whose speech was particularly amusing but completely lacking in substance. But he was a man known for his wry sense of humour and a love of debating. Jock went on to become a lawyer in Wellington, founding the well-known firm Fanslow's, and was very innovative in that firm. He became known around town for advertising on the radio, which was unheard of at the time, and introduced the $500 flat conveyancing fee to New Zealand, which again was an innovation at the time. Sadly, Jock died of cystic fibrosis, which he suffered from his whole life at the age of 48 in January 2006. And when we organised this competition 6 years ago, in 2006, I was surprised and humbled really to be approached by a group of Victoria University of Wellington Debating Society alumni who wanted to donate a cup to the tournament in recognition of Jock, who had died just a few months ago at that point. And the group of alumni who did donate the cup are really a who's who of New Zealand debating society. It was led by Paul Ridley-Smith. One of the contributors was the Honourable Christopher Finlayson, who's currently the Attorney General and the patron of the Victoria University Society. J.L. Wilson, who has gone on to head the World Heart Foundation and is very high up in the UN Development Programme. Author Mary McCallum, Justice Stephen Koch, who is again another Victoria debater, and Peter Biggs, who heads up Cleansure BBDO, the advertising agency in Australia and New Zealand. So they donated a significant sum of money for the Cup and really helped the 2006 tournament actually happen due to their donations. And I'm also very pleased to be able to acknowledge at this point some of the donations that the same group of people have made to this tournament as well. And I know some of the people that I mentioned are here in the audience tonight. Again, it's fantastic that alumni of this debating society that are willing to donate money to an international debating tournament like this to make sure that everyone who comes to Wellington has a great time. But the real reason they gave money in the first place was for the Jock Fanslow Cup, which is awarded the best speaker in the grand final and will be awarded again this year as well, in remembrance of a fantastic debater who did New Zealand proud. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. The final speaker tonight, before we move into the adjudication portion of this evening, is one of our DCAs, Ravi, from Monash University. And he's going to speak on the trophy that we give out called the Martin Sorensen Trophy. Ravi.
On the face of it, it's not easy to speak about Martin Sorensen. He passed away almost 20 years ago, long before even I started at university debating. But in some ways it's not as difficult as it might seem. Because one thing that Monash and the Australasian community have done incredibly well is keeping his legacy alive through things like naming an internal competition after him and the Best Speaker Trophy. Martin was a debater at Monash in the early 1990s. And back then, the idea of an all-Monash grand final at Australs would have been probably laughable. Monash had only made the grand final of Australs once in 1989, and in 1991, Martin led Monash back again. In 1992, with Ben Richards and Matt Deeble, he won Monash's first Australs, and he came back the year after, won Australs, and was the best speaker. Unfortunately, Martin passed away just 3 days after winning Australs for the second time. Like Jock, he also suffered from cystic fibrosis and had a significantly short projected lifespan. One of the saddest things that I've ever heard is hearing teammates and contingent mates of his talking about how when they got off the plane from Malaysia and landed in Melbourne, that was the first time that they heard that Martin just hadn't made it. By all accounts, he knew that that was going to be his last debating tournament. He was very sick and went against doctor's orders. There's two things that everyone who speaks about Martin has to say. The first is that he was an incredible speaker, that he was smart, charming, engaging, that he was one of the best that they'd ever seen. And the second was that he was incredibly humble. He didn't big note himself. And in a game of big egos that is so common in debating, that is remarkably refreshing. He was very reserved and humble. Most people didn't know that he suffered from cystic fibrosis. The Martin Sorensen Trophy has a number of great names on it. Tim Sonreich, Ivan Arsam, Saika Islam, Liz Sheargold, Victor Finkel, Naomi Orb, and many more. And none greater than Martin himself. It commemorates, to me, excellence in debating, but also recognises a life that was with so much potential that was cut tragically short. It reminds us not to squander the gifts that we have, not to take for granted the talent and ability that we have. And I hope that this year's winner, and indeed that all of you, will carry that message with you moving forward. Thank you.
Before we announce the results of the debate this evening, there are some awards arising from other events throughout the tournament that we're going to announce first. And I'd like to call on one of the Deputy Chief Adjudicators, Ali Zosa, to announce the top 5 ESL speakers.
top 5 ESL speakers. Equal 5th from the International Christian University, Koki Sasaki. Also tied 5th, also from the International Christian University, Aiko Imai. Also tied 5th, also from the International Christian University, Min Jae Kim. Fourth ranked ESL speaker from the International Christian University, Kohei Arakawa. Ranked third from the International Islamic University of Malaysia, Khadija binti Shamsul. Also from the International Islamic University of Malaysia, Dina binti Ahmad Murad. And the best ESL speaker for Australs 2012 from the International Islamic University of Malaysia, Mr. Syed Sadiq. To announce the results of the ESL Grand Final, we'd like to call on the chair of that panel, Deputy Chief Adjudicator, Mr. Ravi Datta.
So the ESL Grand Final was held between Macau 1 and ICU 1. In a 7-2 split decision, the 2012 ESL Australs champion, ICU 1. Can we also congratulate the runners-up, Macau 1? Since last year, Australs has also recognised the best reply speaker. This year, the best reply speaker, the only speaker to average over 39, which is 78 for substantive speeches, from the University of Sydney Union, won L. Jones. To award the top 10 speakers in the main break, I'd like to invite Steph Souza.
All top 10 speakers should come to the front to receive their cultural treasure, which is the Punami. So you only get a certificate. Rank 10, from the Victoria University Wellington 1, Richard Duff. Ninth ranked best speaker from the University of Melbourne, Tim Blair. Eighth ranked best speaker from Victoria University of Wellington, Paul Smith. And sixth ranked best speaker from the University of Queensland, Anthony Smith. Also ranked sixth best speaker from the University of Queensland, Kristen Price. I now invite the Chief Adjudicator of the tournament, Steve Whittington, to announce the top 5 best speakers.
The fifth ranked speaker from the University of Queensland, Lauren Humphrey. The fourth ranked speaker from the University of Sydney Union, Eleanor Jones.
the third ranked speaker, also from the University of Sydney Union, Daniel Swain. The second ranked speaker from Monash University, Kieran Iyer. The best speaker of Australs 2012, receiving a Punamu, from Monash University, Christopher Bissett. We move now to the results of the debate that took place this evening. All of the adjudicators thought that it was a very close and very exceptionally high quality debate. And I think that we should just acknowledge the winners of Australs 2012 in a 5-4 split is Monash 1. I'd also like to call forward the runners-up of the Australs Grand Final, Monash 2. I'd now like to hand back to the two co-conveners. Sorry, I neglected to announce the best speaker in the grand final and the winner of the Jock Fanslow Cup. This year, it goes to, from Monash 1, Kieran Iyer. Now I'd like to call on the co-convener.
Just before we say anything, I just wanted to say if all of the winners of any prizes could please come down here afterwards so we can take some formal photos, that'd be great.
As I'm sure you're all aware, a tournament of this size takes an exceptional amount of organisation from an exceptional number of exceptional people. So we just want to take a moment to thank those people formally for all that they have done to make this Australs what has certainly been the best Australs I have ever attended. This is in fact the first Australs. To begin with, we would like to extend a formal thanks to the Deputy Chief Adjudicators of this tournament, who have very much just run the debate inside of it, and quite literally, without their work tonight, the events, the awards could not have happened. The first of those adjudicators is Toshi Hika, who unfortunately can't be with us here tonight because he had to fly back to Japan to defend his master's thesis. So I feel we should give him a round of applause. The second of the DCAs who we would like to thank is Ravi Datta. So Ravi Datta, where's he gone? Thirdly, we would like to thank Steph D'Souza. Then finally, Ali Sosa.
And of course, the man who we all know has been leading this group of exceptional adjudicators, and the person who we owe a lot of thanks for his guidance and his leadership in organising this tournament is the CEO of this tournament, Steve Wellington.
The second group of people who have helped this tournament come together are a group of people who have put in tens, if not hundreds, of hours in organising this tournament. They're people who have been up at the university at 7 a.m. to set out breakfast for you all. They're people who have been up past midnight trying to sort out any difficulties in the tab so that they could run smoothly. These people are the Australs 2012 Organising Committee, and I'll ask them to come down to the floor today, including you, CZ. We have Jodie O'Neill, who's been organising your socials for you. Richard Dar, who has been in charge of your accommodation. Olivia Hall, who has been our communications manager and our equity officer. Cameron Price on food. Sebastian Templeton, the master of our registration system. Philip Leslie, who has done all the design work for this tournament, most of the web work for this tournament, has been the co-tab director. Hugh McCaffrey, who has been our treasurer and our man on the ground for a lot of the tournament. Frank Zingley, who has done the rest of the computer work and is the other co-tab director. And finally, Adam Goodall, who's been our tournament director and has been in charge of all of the volunteers at this tournament.
Thanks everyone once again. One of the final people that we want to, groups of people we want to thank tonight are the runners. These are the people who have guided you to your rooms, input all the information into the tab, cooked your dinner on Kiwi night, made sure that there was good lunch and stuff set out, and just generally helped us out and enjoyed my terrible, terrible jokes. So for all of these things, they're seated up the back. If you could all stand up, and we'd like to thank you very much.
Affiliated to the tournament who have made our job that much easier, we just want to take a moment to thank. So we would like to thank Dean Grocott, manager at Port Hotels, who I think has done an exceptional job at making accommodation at this tournament just not a problem. So thank you to Dean. There are a number of people at the university who facilitated our rooms booking and our sponsorship and have come and answered our calls whenever I say I locked my bag in the kitchen. So for that I would like to thank Tanuja Patel, Sandy Ashworth and Rainsforth Dax. I would also like to thank Kathy Scott Dow, who has come along to all of our events to be our official photographer for much less than we would have had to pay someone else. So I would like to thank very much Kathy for giving up her time. Finally, I would like to thank Christopher Bishop, who you heard from earlier tonight. So Chris organised this tournament in 2006, told us we were on our own for this one, then we got in a bit of trouble, backpedaled on that pretty fast. Without his help, we would not have been able to secure half of the sponsorship that we were able to secure. He's been just a fount of wisdom in the day-to-day running of the tournament, so for all his help and support, I would like to thank Christopher Bishop.
Final thanks this evening goes to a list of individuals who have made a particular financial contribution. We would like to very much thank them for all their support of this tournament. In alphabetical order, they are Christopher Bishop, Chris Lowe, I can't read your handwriting, David Shand, Jenna Rayburn, John Gatley, Josh Cameron, Kirsten Robinson, Kirsty Gunn, Noel Sainsbury, Peter and Mary Biggs, and Randall Clouston. Thank you very much. That's pretty much it from us. For the final words in this tournament, I'd like to invite back to the floor the Chief Adjudicator, Steve Wellington.
There's just really two people left to thank, and those are two people who have literally given hours and hours of their lives in the past year towards running a debating tournament, which is, I have to say, a pretty selfless task to actually undertake. So I'd like you to join me in applauding and thanking for their effort, Johanna McDavid and Daniel Wilson. Here, but if that's all run out, then I would like to invite you all across to the establishment, which is just across the road in broadly that direction, for some drinks, and I believe they are free.